hopefully able to see. Okay, our first speaker today is Matilda Moström. Close enough?
Yeah.
Okay. She's the assistant director of the flow cytometry core at Tulane National Biomedical Research Center. She earned her PhD in biomedical sciences from Tulane University in 2022 with a focus on immunology at the maternal-fetal interface and viral infections during pregnancy. Her work uses flow cytometry to study immune responses in non-human primate models, particularly the cytomegalovirus infection. Dr. Moström is passionate about biosafety, high-parameter cytometry, and maximizing data quality and reproducibility in infectious disease research. The TNBRC Flow Core was recently recognized as an ISAC SRL recognition program for 2025 to 2028, which from what I've heard is a pretty high administrative burden to get done. So congratulations and welcome, Matilda.
Hi. Do the little.
Yes. Is that better? Give you maybe like 20 seconds.
There's a delay. Okay. All right. Thank you all. Thanks for the introduction, Sarah. And welcome to Texas, everybody who's here. We good? Yeah. Perfect. Thank y'all for the confirmation. All right. So I'm going to talk about single stain controls, the way to success, and I'm going to go over topics like the history of best practices, examples of them in use, comparison of what is composition versus mixing, how you get this done best in the lab itself, not just on paper, and then how do you analyze your controls. So the idea here behind my talk is how you climb that long mountain to get those good controls. And if you fall on the way down, then Anna's going to follow up with a new talk about getting you back up to the top. That's my climbing analogy. So what do I mean the accurate composition and mixing? Why should you care about this? I'm going to give you some examples. Has your data ever looked like a banana? That is something we want to avoid. And when I'm talking about this with the laser pointer, it's this data right here. We can no longer see the data. It is beyond 0. It is to the -3rd and more. That's what we don't want to see. So why is that an issue? Because you could say we could just skate around it. But really what we do when we use a flow cytometer is that we measure photons. And these photons arrive at either your APD or PMT, where they're converted into photoelectrons. And then we measure a change in current, which is a positive signal. Therefore, when we see negative data, this is your red flag. Something's gone wrong with my composition or mixing. So that's the first thing. But what about things that are less obvious? So that was just, banana data. Okay, that's your first red flag to look for. Something that's less obvious. That could be something like this. So ignore the export formatting. But what we're looking at here is real data, it's a real story from my work, where we're looking at PPMC and a tissue sample. This is the important sample I care about. Thank you. And we saw this kind of background that I'm pointing to right here. This background, we just excuse as being non-specific. Let's move on. But in deeper dive, this was actually an unrelated parameter causing an issue that we hadn't really considered before. We had one control, or a few, actually 3 of them, in a 28 color panel that was too dim. And after using best practices, having the best optimized controls, we see a cleanup of this population here. And it helps us resolve activated INKTs, which is important for our study. Okay, so now I've shown you data from high parameter panels. Let's really bring it back down into a simpler 5-color experiment, just looking at immune phenotyping. So this is a 5-color panel on a MaxQuant 16. We have 1 color of the violet, 3 of the blue, 1 of the red. There's going to be a little bit of composition needed. There's some spillover, but nothing too crazy. Okay, so this is unpublished data I'm sharing. I just need you to care about what the populations look like, not necessarily what the markers are. And we see nice 90-degree angles between our positive and negatives. This is off certain population. But when we come down to a later time point, we have what's happening on the right. We see these unexpected populations, and collaborator might tell me we can just get around it. And that's not the case, because actually what's happening is that there's another unrelated population that's improperly compensated and is actually inhibiting us from gaining a key population. So now I hope I've convinced you that there are important things that improve our data when we care about these things. So let's take a step back, because what a single state color control really represents is your signal on a single floor in your fully stained sample. That's what it's there for. And when we study flow cytometry and use flow cytometry as a technique, we're measuring photons, I already mentioned. So if I'm a PMT, I'm the PMT, I'm measuring photons. I see them, I grab them, I convert them to electrons. I don't know where that photon came from, right? I'm just measuring signal. So what we do in our software, we tell our software that by measuring our colors that are measured in multiple detectors, where they come from, because then through having that data, we can perform compensation, which is a mathematical process to address multicolor experiments where we have colors that are measured in multiple detectors. And that's also why it's important. I said mathematical process. It uses linear algebra. And because of this is why we need to measure compensation controls that are on the linear range for a detector. I'll come back to that later. But that's kind of preamble of why we're doing here. So how did we get here? What are the best practices and how did they come about? When we perform multicolor experiments with flow cytometry, we've moved from manual to automatic compensation, which is a huge advantage. Manual compensation is done by eye, and by looking at the value, applying a more or less compensation, a little bit more. This is when we have perfect compensation, we go over or way over. And that's kind of cumbersome and hard to reproduce between two people. So automatic compensation has lowered the barrier for higher parameter work. And then we can look at the Purdue listserv and in the archive for when best practices were discussed. So in 2010s, this is 2011, Mario Roeder is describing best practices, and he's sarcastically noting that it has nothing to do with the voltages, filters, autofluorescence, cell types, beads, data week, phase of the moon, operator of the mood. And he also describes universal negative instrument settings, which I'm going to come back to later. But I think the first good public place for best practices was found is on the Daily Dongle blog, which was run by employees at TreeStar and FlowJo. The parent website that hosts the Daily Dongle is down, so you actually can't find the Daily Dongle anymore, which is a concern to me because I think it's a great resource for historical reasons and as a community. You can currently get this on the web archive, but it's a little cumbersome, but it is there. Anyway, then we started moving to bead-based controls instead of cells. People love this. There was some hesitation at first, but we like them now as a community, I think, because they're easy to use. They are always going to provide a bright signal as opposed to a dim cell marker. They have very uniform autofluorescence, but there are some things that we should pay attention to when we move into high parameter spectral space, which is becoming more obvious currently. Okay, so what are the rules? I showed you some screenshots, but let's actually talk about them. So the first rule of compensation is that the controls need to be as lead as brighter or brighter. And within that, it needs to be on scale in the linear range, which comes back to that because we use linear algebra. Second, the background fluorescence should be the same for the positive and negative controls. And this comes into play a lot when we use different types of beads, different types of cells for compensation and mixing. And finally, the most obvious one is that we need to, as any good scientist in our experiments, we prepare our controls as we do our fully stained by matching the reagents we use and the way we run the instrument. It's kind of a fourth bonus rule that we use enough data for the statistics. So for beads, it's around about 10,000 events, or for cells, I'd say at least 30,000 is good. You might have to amp that up depending on the frequency of your marker. Okay, so those are them, but let's look at them in practice. That's kind of boring, right? So how do you practically make such controls? Here's an example where there's a violation of the first rule. So what you're looking at here is data that's hyper-negative beyond 0 for this y-axis. And it comes into play because my composition control here is about the first decade of 10 to the third. And it gets worse beyond that. So I knew about this already. So I used another vendor's beads to address this. And when I use the right control, I see this nice orthogonal pattern, 90-degree angles. And here's a different example, which has a little bit more to it. So in this case, yeah, my Grand Sine B AL700 is quite dim, not ideal. And I have my brightest data, which I may be cared the most about, is very negative. Okay, so I use brighter control. Okay, and when I do this, the data is still hypernegative. Notice how I needed to scale out optimize the scaling to even see the end of the data. So the second story that comes from here is that I'd optimized this while titrated on PBMC. So I had an understanding of what my reagent looks like on my fully stained sample already. Okay, but when I look at the data that's coming from the non-lymphocytes in the deciduous sample, it's way brighter way more than I anticipated. So this was new for me to discover. And I also know now that SS Fluor 700, SS Fluor, that might be better used on cells. So that's what I would do next. And I would specifically use decidual cells. My precious cells, it might just be something I have to face. That's what I'm going to need for my experiments. And the second rule in practice is that different material you stain has different background. So here's an example of unstained PPMC. It's pretty low all throughout from my thawed cells, using my buffers, using my certifications. And arc beads versus Virtec beads, you can see here there's a difference in that early violet detector, which I'm gonna come back to. So yeah, no matter if you're running a particle or a cell, they have different background. And here's this in practice. Here I'm looking at data that was about 25 color panel. And either I'm using the universal negative for global, the global unstained, so that is a Virtec bead particle. And I end up with this hyper negative data. And when I go ahead and use the internal negative, my arc beads, I improve that data. There's still some more optimization to be done in this panel, but it really helps rescue that pattern. And you can read more about this, about choosing and how you handle your internal negative in the OMIP 102 supplemental. Don't you say it for me. Then the third rule, use the same reagents. I think this is a very obvious one. Anna's going to talk more about this. So I'm going to leave that open for now. Then I mentioned earlier composition and mixing. Mixing sounds scary, right? But we'll talk about it and make it less scary. So why is the bar higher for controls when it comes to spectral data? And I think we should take a back step, because the core concept I need everyone to understand is that in spectral cytometry, we're looking at the so-called spectral fingerprint or spectral profile. I think a dear child has many names, whatever you say, that idiom. I like calling it spectral signature. And we still do this in conventional cytometry. This is a A5 looking at BV421. So in the primary detector, we have a lot of signal, but we also see it in other neighboring channels. And we see some cross UV excitation on the UV. But this is what it looks like on a spectral instrument, the same Fluor, BV421. And I'm going to teach you how to read this, as these are unfamiliar to you. But on the top, we're looking at 421, which has the peak emission right here. And 711 has kind of emission in multiple detectors. So the way you read this is that you take that same histogram that you might be familiar with, and we flip it on its side. Ding. And here, what we're looking at is the most data here at the top, the median of my positive signal, is the warmest color on over here. So the colder the color, green to blue, that's less data. We're just kind of showing that tail here. And the position on the spectral histogram is telling you the brightness, just like this it does. So then we can pull in our whole spectral diagram, pull it over, and that's really the same thing. We're really looking at 48 kind of histograms that are flipped on their side for each detector. Okay, so that's how you read these spectral diagrams. So what does unmixing do? Compensation versus unmixing is a similar process. When it comes to spectral instruments, they have additional detectors, and the specific locations of these filters is selected to capture space that we're not capturing otherwise. And the software is different on how we fit that signal onto our fully stained. So instead of a rectangular mixed matrix, when we have the same number of colors as detectors that we use for spectral compensation, we use a rectangular matrix where we have a set number of floors, but we have additional detectors that we measure our signal with. So if that's a little abstract, I like using some analogies. So you've probably heard of the mixing analogy with colors, where we try to understand what is the abundance of the primary colors in our fully stained sample. I like using a cocktail party analogy, where you might have an AC unit running in the background, you have two people talking, two people laughing, there's some music playing, and that overall comes into the sound that you experience. And then we try to understand what is the volume of the specific guitar or the people whispering some gossip over there. And then you think about that same cocktail analogy, that AC unit that's running in the background, that is your cellular autofluorescence. So as you have your cells, they experience a level of activation, metabolism, they have aromatic compounds that have autofluorescence. So as light shines on them, they emit light. And this depends on exactly how your cells are treated, what cell sample you're working with, and it's a powerful tool that we need to leverage. And I think I'm happy to see so many talks covering this. So we're going to hear more about this today. So now I've talked about theory a lot. Let's actually go to the bench and at the instrument. I'd like you to get familiar with the die you're running. You don't need to memorize it. No need, no, don't fret. What I want you to do is make use of your spectral viewers. There's the die you're running is going to be found on one of them, maybe multiple. Keep in mind that they have different configurations, maybe pre-populated. So you might have to have the configuration at hand, especially for a conventional instrument. But then when you run your sample, assess, is this what I expect or not? Am I seeing the same signal I normally see with this die? And when you look at a spectral plot, I want to point out that the spectral viewers are going to show you normalized data, which is linear from 100% at the very top of the peak to the bottom, while raw sign data that you see at the cytometer might be in log or by exponential transformation. But the same concept still applies, that you're looking for patterns. So you're looking for the peaks and the valleys, the shapes. If it looks like a piano, it's up and down, or it's not. And as you sit at the cytometer, be in charge of your controls and make note of what you see. So at the Primate Center Flow Core, Biomedical Research Center, we have these submission sheets that are used for all experiments, and we have these small tabletop scanners. So all your observations you make, you're going to note them down. Do you need to replace a control? Do I see something odd about these cells? And then we scan these at the end of the run, and it's stored next to the data on the server. So that way, in your future 2 years from now, I go back and look at this experiment, you can tell what happened. And this is an example of what this might look like, where we document replacement of specific controls, any unusual patterns we saw that wasn't found on this page otherwise. So the next thing I'll talk about is additional recommendations beyond the original 4 I just mentioned. This is from the CITO tutorial last year, where we should take note when we're doing spectral experiments, if our beads is altering that spectral signature, do I actually need to use cells instead? Or are they exchangeable? That depends. Having cellular controls is helpful because it matches that cellular environment. Anything that we do towards the cells, certain buffers, certain material we spike in. But There are some things to keep in mind that some dyes might have very variable staining, and you're gonna have to keep your conditions tight. The sixth rule is kind of always been there, but it's never maybe been said well, and I think we should really have that added, that you should run your controls the same day. There are some nuances to this, some depending on what platform you're on, but I think a good rule of thumb is having them available. Okay, so how do you make them? Now we talked about cells and such. I'm going to go over these few topics of actually success in the wet lab, so away from the cytometer, but upstream. So what do you do when things don't work the way you're supposed to? What do you handle rare populations and so on? So I have now a video for you, and we're going to hope that the audio works. Otherwise, I'm going to have to talk real fast. We'll see. But yeah, this is a short video. I'm pointing out how to stain a good BB composition control. So two things I want to highlight in the video is when you vortex your beads, vortex the shit out of them. They can take it. You can even sonicate them if you want. Vendors might even do this themselves when they handle their beads for R&D testing. So don't be scared of that. And the same thing is caring about the volume. If you're shaky, you had too much coffee that morning, you can make a bead suspension and pipette it. It's not my style, but that might be something that's more reproducible. It's going to get it all the way to the bottom every time. And this is the results. So I did just do this for fun. What you want to see is that no matter what time you do it, they end up with the same overlapping spectral pattern. The next thing is a little story I did because I wanted to break the system. I wanted to make this not so good. And this comes into mind when we transfer our samples between labs or when we have to store them because there's a hurricane coming through. So this is BV 785, which I think is a bad rep. This is after 1 hour of ambient light. So this is the flow core at Tulane, where Primate Center, Biomedical Research Center. And this is the ambient lighting we have. Notice that the lighting in our room is facing upward. It's not quite clear in this picture, but that is something that could contribute to what I see here. This is overlaid with the 1 hour data. Then my animation is not working well. This is 2 hours, the same exact pattern. So I was frustrated. Why isn't this deteriorating? So I did, I put a flashlight right in front of it. Really trying to light that up. So I did 10 minutes and it's still the same. You can see, it's a little bit of a trend right there, but not a lot. So then I was even more frustrated, so I went outside where the sun was going down. It was around 5 p.m. To 6 p.m. at the priming center. So in direct sunlight, we get this really impressive shift. So now you're looking at the brown data where we've completely deteriorated the 785 tandem. We're just left with a 421 signal. So that was, to me, was super impressive how that little bit of sunlight, like a 2-minute walk between buildings, you're gonna need to cover that real good. So maybe the lighting in our labs is something we should pay closer attention to. Flashlight was starting to make it drift. I think I have a little close up here, excuse me. Here, where you're starting to see the brightening, the green light, sorry, the green color is the flashlight. So you're starting to see a shift up to the final direction that the sunlight received. But moving on from light exposures, you make your beads and you bring them through the core and you're running on a cytometer. It doesn't work. And then we tell them to go stand again. It doesn't work still. Well, let's see, maybe they actually don't cross-react to the beads, so that's why you will never get them to bind. We have a recombinant monoclonal rapid IG. It does not bind at many manufacturers, or a rhesusized antibody that we struggle with. So get creative here and talk to your vendors because they might have something up your sleeve. So here's a protein GB, which I have made use of, or our labs have, where there's a Staph aureus cell wall protein called protein G. It is an immune evasion protein. It binds the back end of FC. And it from multiple species as well. And that's a great use case for finding a positive binding particle, but then you won't have a negative. So you'll need to provide an internal negative by maybe using a BSA coated bead that has a matching autofluorescence pattern as the protein G beads alone. Moving on to something that isn't an antibody, what about a fluorescent protein? These are tricky. They might seem simple, but they're not. Because we have changes that happens when we, for example, transduce cells. You can have a positive signal, but that change in the cellular state changes the autofluorescence. So we need to either provide a mock control, a scrambled gene, to create a negative control for a positive G expressing cell. If you can't make that, you don't have those available to you, maybe you need to use a parent passage, but make sure then that it's the same age and cell size so that they have matching autofluorescence as much as you can. Do your best. There might be some commercial resources out there, which I was going to link, but I actually couldn't find one yesterday. I feel like maybe someone could tell me differently, but I couldn't find. Okay, so we're moving over now to cells. So how many cells do you stain? All right, that's the first question, right? Okay, well, it's not just a drop of beads. How many cells do I use? My precious cells. I heard from Kathy Daniels. She told me about 4% of total events, which has to do with statistics, that at some point, the more beads you run, or cells, you will still have the same pattern. I also have this postmortem trick I'm going to show you in the next slide. But pay attention to, you might have, like in my case with the decidual cells, I might have one expression pattern, but the next patient or donor doesn't. So one approach is to pool different patient samples, so you at least might catch one or two that have high expression of your important marker. And obviously care for the sample type. You might see, like I did, that your tissue has higher expression. So you're gonna need to use that instead of a PBMC, maybe. Okay, so this is a quick video. I want you to notice the data down here, over here, and over here. So excuse how tired I was while recording that. The point is that you can use this as a rule of thumb for trying to see, okay, how making a rule for yourself, how many cells can I get away with? If I have to make a decision at the bench, can I do 500,000? Can I do 250,000? What do I really need? This is a fairly highly expressed marker. But the point here is the stability of the fluorescence. It might happen early or late. So that's a trick I would do. But you're gonna need to do that upfront testing yourself. Because it's gonna depend on the antigen density, how many cells can you spare? So combine both what you know about your samples and your pattern and test it. And keep in mind, you wanna use the same titer do you do on your single stain as you do on your fully stained. Don't just use the same amount like you would for the beads. That's what we titer. Use the same. So keep in strict control over the way you stain your samples, the way you spin your cells, wash your cells, mash them as well on your cells. And this is a favorite topic of mine, gating compensation controls. I think this gets missed. So I often see people gating the wrong populations. Here I've done 3. I've done population A, B, and C. And they're here overlaid. And then I have a histogram for the primary detector and a non-primary detector. Notice that, yes, Matilda, yes, you use the brightest events. So they proceed with this. But notice what happens that blue population that is one of the aggregates, it has a different pattern of a different detector because what's up here is aggregates and schmutz and debris bound to your beads. So avoid those. Gate on your single stained controls, your single bead population, which is going to be that lower left corner that is not debris, depending on this population will move around as you change forward and side scatter voltages, but in relation to the aggregates, it's going to be the bottom left. Next up is where to place the gate. So I see a lot of people come around pretty liberal gating around the single bead population. What ends up happening is getting that schmutz aggregates, again, are supposed to be stringent. You take that tight gate on your single bead population, and you have a nice clean data. Here's a different example that I wanted to show because it's doubly bad. So here it is a liberal gate, and the data is ending up being off scale. And we have for a bead instrument, linearity, depending on the detector, you have to check this for yourself. On my end, generally it's around the upper end here. So we're gonna be using, in this case, what this gating provides you is nonlinear data that's gonna have different emission than you really have. So be stringent, get that gate done, and now I have linear data in the green. And then once you get your single population, okay, I got my nice singlet bead population gated. The choice of where you place the positive gate depends. So there's either, maybe in the middle or to the right, but I want you to, as a practice, always make sure you have the brightest population included. And if you're kind of tethering on that roundabout, when you're fully stained is right similar to your control, you might benefit from really pulling it to the right. And don't just use the very tippy toe, but provide enough data. The technical limit is 100 events and 2% of parent. I wouldn't recommend being right there, but a little bit more than that at least. And with that, I'd like to thank you all, especially the Flow core staff, Hannah, Natalie, Ethan, Mitty, Sam, who are not here, but are listening in on Zoom, or YouTube. Thank you all. Are we doing questions now or later? Are there any questions? I think I forgot.
All right, last question. What is
Oh. We don't have one. I will rephrase it. Oh, here. Are they here? We'll get them set up. I don't know if that's on.
Okay, how about that?
Yeah, that works.
Okay. Most common mess ups, that's my question. Most common mess ups you're seeing in a core, and then a second question is going to be I'm a very lazy scientist. I don't want to do all the things you just suggested.
That's-
What are the most important?
Yeah, right.
All of them, but for any other lazy scientist, but
I'll start with the second question. So, lazy, but what is the bare minimum, I guess, is the question. I think the controls come down to a grayscale because the complexity of your experiment raises the bar you need to optimize your controls. And I think people underestimate optimizing your controls because some people do understand that optimizing your panel is good, but then that last bit is so important. So I think making use, if you are lazy, you are maybe if you have limited resources, let's be realistic. I think running data by somebody who is not in your lab, who has expertise, is a great way to see, okay, can my collaborator who's skilled spot an issue that's going to be critical. So I think having somebody else look, what is the critical things at least you need to do, and taking care of that is like pushing that grayscale towards like the top of the mountain more. Then yeah, because we don't have all the way time in the world. And then the other question about common mishaps. I think the internal versus positive, I think is something, and the gating of the beads, I think is a common mishap that is overlooked. And I like, we do composition and mixing at the instrument, but then in FlowJo, I'm sitting and spending time looking, okay, is everything where it needs to be? Things get flipped. Some people, they don't provide an internal negative, or they get doublet populations, and it causes issues. Yeah, this is a good question. Connie has a question. You want to walk it over?
hand delivered.
Thank you, Matilda. Great talk. I can't stress enough after 25 years of single color data that Alexa 700 should never be prepared on beads. So thank you for that. And louder for those in the back.
Yeah.
Never. So panel design, choosing a marker for 700 where you will be able to have a sufficient signal to use the cells. That's
Right.
very important. I know this isn't a panel design talk.
No,
But then my question for you, I know that people with BD instruments, our CS&T baseline report tells us the max and the linear range for each detector. How do we find that on other companies' instruments or on spectral instruments?
right. So there is an approach that I've attempted to do, but I haven't run it on a non-BD instrument. You can make use of 8-peak beads and assess linearity through this like M1, M2 superfetto paper to try and measure where your linearity falls off. And it's involves, in my opinion, a little bit of objectivity by eyeballing where you're placing the gazing and like assessing the linearity. But that at least gives you the power to, and the confidence of like, when is it no longer linear? So there is a way to do that. We can talk about it. Yeah.
So I'm just gonna hand deliver it now.
How long can you store
Oh.
compensation controls? Sorry, this is very loud. Store compensation controls. In what buffer should you store them? And are there any other floors you have experience with, like BB 786 or 785? Because we had that problem, that are also very fragile and maybe shouldn't be stored
Yeah.
for too long.
Right. This is a great question. I love the question about stability over time. Because I've done some aging experiments, because it doesn't cost you anything. Like, you can prepare your experiment and just keep your own prepared controls in your condition and run them a day later, a week later. I did an experiment running 1 week, 2 week, 4 weeks, and comparing to the same day recorded. And it was surprisingly stable. So I was blown away by the stability, but maybe I'm just lucky and I have just like the reagents that are stable. But then when you come across something that is not, because we do see that too, the same rules don't apply. So I hate to break that, like, we have to do our own testing for every single thing, but I think the stability testing is one that takes little to no resources, and empowers you when you have those things that catastrophe, you run out of like essential QC beads, or the hurricane comes through and everybody's out sick. What do you do? Pandemic. No. The other question about, I would like have multiple potentially. Like what we do at the Tulane Biomedical Primary Center core is that we store backups for people that may be the exact same or slightly different, and offer people, would you like us to check one of our backups that we would have otherwise tossed in the trash for people when they're done with an experiment? So then you come down, it's not the same catalog number. But if I have one that is completely fallen off, then yeah, we request somebody to replace it, make that phone call. But if they can't, then maybe a suitable surrogate can be used. And then the buffer question, thank you. I'm not entirely sure about this, right? I debate between this, whether it should be something that prevents the tandems from deteriorating. Maybe we should not put them in fixatives and leave them in. Should we be washing them? And I guess it also depends, which I hate to say, but I mean, there are also data like, even though we don't combine multiple colors in our single stains, but adding brilliant violet buffer in those single stain controls. But there's also available like stabilization buffers now on the market. And I have had users test this themselves, their own data, and seeing that there's tandem stabilizing buffer, something from BioLegend, helps improve the stability. Yeah, no problem. You have a question?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I appreciated the practicality of your talk, and I have two questions. One of you might just have answered. First question, going back to your video of staining your single stain controls, you incubated first with the positive beads and
Right.
then you added the negative beads. Have you found that that makes much of a difference than just adding both positive and negative
Together
beads
at
up
first.
front?
There are differences, and I think me and Anna had a conversation about this, that there is like antibodies, the state that they bind, like any antibody, is really on off. And if you have available substrates nearby that has a little bit of non-specific binding, the negative does tend to like start hiking up. And then we'll have to ask ourselves, is that a true negative control or not? Because then you're really looking at bead plus a little bit of antibody as opposed to bead with a lot of antibody, which is just not going to tell you the background of the bead. So that's why I'm a little bit more in favor of the second, but
Okay.
yeah, depends on the catalog number you're using for your beads.
Okay. And then also with the brilliant violet and brilliant ultraviolet polymer dyes, where when you mix them together, you have to use the brilliant stain buffer. When you're doing your single stain controls, does it matter if they're in brilliant stain buffer or not? Does it make a difference?
There's something that there's a small little difference. I just haven't had good data seeing myself like positive or negative. But when like it's a very, I think, simple to me step to try and make my controls be as similar as possible to the fully stained. So just spiking in a little bit of that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
That's a good question, yeah.
question.
Okay, can we use both beads and cells as comp controls for the same panel? That's from online.
Yes, so you can. I'm not sure if the question is like, having some colors like your violets be cells and then your other reds are in beads. That is possible. You have to keep in mind that software might default to using the universal negative. That's not going to match then. That violates the second rule of compensation, non-mixing. And the other question, can you have both? Like I also can say, if the other question is phrased the other way, that recording two sets of controls, one with all beads, one with all cells, as you first develop the panel and get comfortable with it, is a way to understand and then test postmortem, did it matter if I used a bead or cell? And then go through your reagents and see this beads is all good, or maybe for this one critical marker, I have to use cells or adjust the panel to avoid that. That would be how I answer that question. Any other questions?
Hey, thank you.
Thank you.